When your neighbor's house is on fire, you do not ask why or how it might affect property prices in the area. You just put the fire out. The moral clarity and urgency of the issue in Sudan is so great that it prompts immediate response, and only government achieves that. First, what is the problem in Sudan? There is a civil war with an unequal balance of power between the two military sides, which leads to sporadic violence and constant uprising, which saps confidence in democratic institutions in the long run and leads to humanitarian and refugee crises in the short. What will we do about this on opening government? We will assemble an international task force under the auspices of the UN, as has successfully been done in East Timor, Lebanon, and many other places. We will crucially ensure that there is broad-based regional support for this, from regional actors like Egypt and other Middle Eastern powers. This means there's an inherent incentive for the crisis to be resolved, because these actors don't want to prolong a humanitarian crisis on their doorstep. Second, we have learned from the past. All the examples opposition will give you about forever wars and unsuccessful interventions are precisely what we learn from, no thank you, in these key mistakes that we have made. So we will not, for example, go in without clear intentions. We will not bulldoze over existing institutions and existing cultural practices as was done in Afghanistan. We will respect people on the ground and ensure that we work with them towards a future that is better. What are the aims of this intervention? The first is the direct protection of civilians in the short run. Even if we cannot solve the civil war in the long run, at least we ensure that when the military comes towards civilians, there is a blue helmet standing in the way. The second thing we do is we give health, food, and infrastructural aid to people on the ground. That is impossible in the absence of a military intervention because both sides of the civil war have an incentive to block this crucial aid from going in. And in the long run, we will build democracy. We will rebuild civilian courts with reconciliatory mechanisms. We will restore faith in democratic institutions in the long run, which can only be achieved, no thank you, when violence is abated. I will prove two things. The first is that we protect civilians, and the second is that we achieve reconstruction. First, protecting civilians. I would note that this is by far the most important goal in this round, because it is certain and urgent. For example, if you see someone drowning, you don't think about whether saving them might increase moral hazard slightly because it prompts more people to drown themselves on the basis that you will save them. You just save them because it is a morally pressing issue. And given that the civilians in these countries have done nothing wrong, they are by far the most important actor. How do we do this? We would note that a lot of the violence that takes place in a civil war is unplanned and sporadic. So it is not the kind of violence you get when a military leader orders an incursion into a certain town. It is what you get when you get vigilante groups, no thank you, in a town, or unplanned uprisings against a certain other group. What happens is feuds and other kinds of low-level insurgencies spiral out into broader conflicts which neither side of the conflict can resolve. UN peacekeepers achieve two things to resolve this. The first is deterrence. Many of the soldiers on both sides of the civil conflict are poorly trained and poorly paid, and they don't have extensive experience fighting in the kind of military conflicts, no thank you, that we are going to engage in on our side of the house. And even if it is true that some UN peacekeepers are not necessarily optimal, people on the ground don't know that, right? All they see is the UN logo and the blue helmet and all of the associations that they have with that, and that effectively deters them, because many of these people have not been as trained as these UN peacekeepers. The second thing that UN peacekeepers achieve is they act as a tripwire, right? You don't want to be the person who killed a UN peacekeeper, because all the hellfire of the country which sent that UN peacekeeper will rain down upon you at the point that occurs. That is a far greater deterrent than just someone on the other side of the civil war, because they know there's international backing behind the UN peacekeeper that is there. And so even if the number of UN peacekeepers is small, the very fact that they exist in those civilian areas prevents militias from engaging in sporadic violence against civilians there. That is the most important impact, because it means that violence against civilians can directly be prevented. Secondly, in the long run, however, it also increases civilian legitimacy. We would note that neither side of the conflict in Sudan has civilian legitimacy in the status quo, and that is because there's severe distrust on both sides as a result of the prolonged conflict, deteriorating humanitarian conditions, and all those kinds of things. And therefore, it is not very difficult for UN peacekeepers to have at least marginally more legitimacy in the eyes of civilians when they go into these conflicts, especially if they protect civilians in precisely the way we described. Because all civilians in these areas want to do is get on with their lives. They don't really care about the broader political aims of these movements, and therefore the UN is better able to achieve this. Yes?
Your model is incredibly unclear. Will you work with the RSF, the SAF, both, or neither?
Well, it broadly depends on local circumstances, right? So in areas where one power is more dominant, we will work with them, but we don't have a kind of, specific inclination towards either side, because we think both sides lack civilian legitimacy for precisely the reasons I have described. So why do we reconstruct this Sudan effectively in the long run? There are three main mechanisms. The first is that effective justice is crucial for reconstruction because it reduces vigilantism. A main reason why confidence in these institutions is sapped in the long run is because people take justice into their own hands. They don't have confidence that the courts or military police will enforce the law and therefore engage in vigilantism, which provokes further cycles of conflict into the long run. When the UN is able to come in and prevent these things by dispensing civilian justice through the establishment of civilian and military courts, that reduces the impetus for vigilantism and thereby reduces cycles of violence. This is particularly the case when we have reconciliatory strategies, right? So we learn from our experience, for example, in Yugoslavia, where we impose the kinds of things which are more likely to lead to reconciliation in the long run, rather than the prolonging of ethnic feuds. This means, for example, that we don't directly point blame in all instances where it's not necessarily productive to do so, but engage in reconciliatory tactics like mediation instead. Finally, what is our exit strategy in this debate? We would note that a large reason why an exit strategy has been impossible in many other countries is because of the hubris of the intervening power. And as I noted at the top of the speech, that is something we have learned from. In specific, what many of these countries did not do is respect existing legal systems and arrangements. So they did not respect, for example, the way that power was distributed in these communities, or they did not respect the kind of non-Western legal systems that these countries had. And it is very possible for the UN on our side to introduce a kind of civilian justice system that respects these legal systems, rather than imposing something completely foreign. That is a key benefit, because it increases trust in the justice system on our side and allows the West to eventually exit in the long run, because it leads to a proper civilian government on our side that is far better. Why is this important? Because not only does it mean we protect civilians in the long run, but also in the short run, but also in the long run as well. I would note that these are the most important people in this debate, because even if it is true that the intervention costs some lives in the short run, because you have to go into the country and engage in war, we suggest that those people are marginally less important, right? Because these are soldiers from either side who are less innocent than the civilians who we are protecting on our side. And given that the civilians on our side have done nothing wrong and nothing to deserve the kind of treatment that they currently suffer under, they are the most important actor. In fact, we would suggest that on the counterfactual, Western governments are guilty by omission for failing to protect civilians in the Sudan. For all of those reasons, propose.
I thank that speaker for that fine speech called Ella. Hear, hear. Contrary to what Prime Minister says, the Sudanese civil war is already an internationalized civil war. The RSF illegally exports gold to the UAE and Russia, and in return, they directly supply them with weapons in Chadian air bases, and they direct their militias in Chad and Haftar-controlled areas of Libya to enter Dhofar and provide support there. Conversely, the SAF uses Ukrainian drones operated by Azeri drone operators sent by Turkey to pummel civilian operations in Kordofan. We should not send more people into that conflict. We should not fight fire with fire. What we should do is pull those people out, reduce the supply of weapons, mean that the sides in that conflict have less to pummel each other with, and that is how we reduce civilian deaths. I'm first going to explain our countermodel. Then I'll identify why that countermodel will simmer the conflict down. Finally, I'll explain why intervention is likely to occur poorly and to make the situation worse, or they will deal with reconstruction. First, this is a policy debate. We have counter-fiat. What will we use that counter-fiat on? Two things. Firstly, ceasing all current forms of military support and intervention for the sides in Libya. That looks like the RSF no longer being backed by the UAE, Russia, Chad, and Haftar. It looks like the SAF no longer being backed by Egypt, Ukraine, and Turkey. They do not provide weapons. They do not provide funding. They do not accept gold or oil exports illegally given. Secondly, we'll engage in non-military forms of intervention and pressure. Those are threefold. Firstly, the leaders of major groups will be placed under sanctions. People like Hamedi Dagalo will be under international sanctions where they currently are not. Secondly, we will impose a weapons ban. That will include things like secondary sanctions. If the UAE continues to defy United Nations orders and continues to fly weapons into Chadian air bases that will then enter Dhofar, the UAE will be hit with secondary sanctions. Third, we'll apply the maximum amount of diplomatic pressure given to us by our counter-fiat to resolve these issues. First argument, these things that we are doing will resolve the current war. And I'm going to note the difference in analysis between what I am about to give and what that Prime Minister's speech gives. Because that Prime Minister's speech is about simmering down local conflicts, local tensions. But that's not the war that is being fought. The war that is being fought is two sides, which are increasingly fragmenting, but still two sides with enormous numbers of weapons, enormous capacity, enormous strength. Why do we simmer down the conflict? 3 ways. Firstly, there are fewer weapons to fight the conflict with. There are fewer guns, fewer drones, fewer airstrikes, fewer airplanes being flown in from Egypt to supply the SAF. That is enormously helpful. Secondly, there's less money going into these areas because these groups are now no longer able to smuggle goods out and then sell them on the black market, sell them to people like the UAE and Russia. They use that money to do 2 things. Firstly, they use it to buy more weapons, which is going to escalate the conflict further. We take away their capacity to buy those weapons. But secondly, in particular areas of the conflict, particularly in Dhofar and Kordofan, the areas that are the people that are fighting the war are often mercenaries because those areas have splintered and have almost never been under Sudanese government control. So these groups no longer have the military and money power to buy those groups out and to get them to fight on their side. Thirdly, without the backing of international powers, the combatants in this war will feel less confident because currently, even if they suffer battlefield losses, like the RSF recently took when they lost control of part of West Kordofan, they feel like they can keep fighting on because they feel like if they ever get too weak, their backer will step up and provide more support because their backer doesn't want to lose the sunk cost. But now their backer has stepped out, so if they start losing, there's nothing to stop them keeping losing, which is why they are likely to go to the table. What does this mean happens? Firstly, there's less capacity to engage in enormously destructive harms to civilians. For instance, there will be drones there, I guess, residually. A, the flow of drones in will stop, but B, most sides don't have drone operators themselves. They use Russian or Azeri drone operators to fly those drones. Those drone operators have left because of our counter model. They are less likely to help them supply it. But secondly, this is likely to push them towards the table, push them towards the solution. Or they will elaborate on why this is likely to work politically. But just note that if you believe you're close to a solution, if you believe you're vulnerable and don't have strength, that's when you tone down the attacks. Because that's when you want the other side to start seeing you as a legitimate negotiating power. You want the other side to see you as a legitimate actor in the conflict. So that explains the withdrawal of troops will do what we need it to do. Closing. Opening.
It's possible to be enormously violent and very little effect. Just see the Rwanda genocide. Why do you think they don't have enough weapons to keep this conflict going on for years and years?
Firstly, Rwanda genocide actually had an enormous flow of weapons. They were supplied by both militias in the Congo and France. Secondly, it is not possible to do that. Things like the large-scale drone attacks, large-scale airstrikes that do the most damage, that do things like kill hospitals, that do things like take out C blocks in those areas are gone. But thirdly, weapons get used up, bullets get used up, drones get shot down, planes get shot down. If you stop the supply into it, that is what trickles it down into the long term. Why is intervention likely to occur poorly and make the conflict worse? Firstly, it is going to be done badly. And I know it's done by the UN, but it will be done badly in 3 regards. Firstly, the groups that constitute the UN forces will not be neutral. The UN doesn't have its own standing army. It has people that go into their own forces. And there are 2 types of countries that are likely to be involved. The first are countries that use the UN peacekeeping as a way to pay their own soldiers. So that's things like Bangladesh, which sends most of the Rapid Action Battalion into the UN to pay its own soldiers. Those countries don't want to deploy their forces into war because they're just doing it there to get rid of police forces they can't pay. But secondly, there are countries that are involved, as they say in their model, that are regional powers that have backed and will continue to back actors. Those are countries like the UAE, which backs the SAF. That means that they will do things like continue to provide tacit support, continue to provide tacit alignment with the countries they will. And PM allows them to do so because in response to the POI, they say, well, in different areas, we'll pick different sides of the conflict to back. So the UAE-controlled areas of the UN police force will just support the RSF in those areas. Second reason it's likely to be done badly. There'll be weapons spillover. That's firstly because it's hard to make sure that all of the weapons you're flying in as part of the UN are in the same area. That's what happened in Haiti. Most of the Haitian gangs these days use UN weapons from the 2010 intervention. But secondly, there's an incentive to let those weapons slip out of your control because you back those groups, because you think that it's good for them to have weapons. So that weapon spillover makes the conflict worse, but I note it also makes other conflicts worse because other areas in this region are very unstable. Places like Chad and Libya and South Sudan have their own rebel groups, which are currently fighting in Sudan. So if they get access to those weapons, if they can funnel them back home, all of those countries experience more harms as well. Thirdly, there's likely to be resource extraction. That is, the UN peacekeepers will be operating in areas which have enormously valuable resources. For instance, the gold mines that the RSF uses. Those peacekeepers, which just belong to national states, have every incentive to try and smuggle some of that gold out, every incentive to destroy the legitimacy this international mission might have at the beginning. Finally, even if it is done perfectly, this intervention will make the war worse for 3 reasons. Firstly, it will fragment the conflict for 2 reasons. Firstly, these guys literally say they're backing one side in one area and backing the other side in the other area. So they're literally supporting further fragmentation, supporting whoever manages to get control of one state, staying in power of that state forever. Secondly, the people position themselves around the international conflict. When Myanmar was intervened in, people in Myanmar fragmented over whether to support interventions or not support interventions. That's likely to occur again. Secondly, it gives groups a reason to fight. There are an enormous number of terrorist groups operating in this area. ISIS groups, Al-Qaeda groups, Al-Shabaab groups. They now have a Western actor that has intervened in a context. They have boots on the ground that they can fight with. The flow of jihadis into Sudan will accelerate dramatically. Thirdly, the intervention itself will cause deaths. They will have to drone strike people. They will have to shoot people. And those deaths are worse because the West is complicit, because the West is the one firing the bullets. It has intervened far too often in the Arab world. It should not do so again.
Two factions in Sudan are treating innocent civilians like pawns. Atrocities and war crimes are regularly committed across the country in the name of a greater cause. Those political machinations pose an existential threat to the lives of hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians. And we are the side that gives you a clear way to protect these people. On their side, they would do nothing. They would sit back and they could continue allowing the untold suffering of so many people continue. And the problem is that despite what they would have you believe, there is no civilian legitimacy left within the Sudan. Yes, it may be that at the beginning of the war you had a clear delineation of sides, but given the erosion of existing institutions and systems, given the continual fighting and basically the usurpation of power by the military on both sides, that is precisely when people have lost faith. The first thing I want to do is be very clear about what we're using our fiat to do in the short term and why it is that this solves the concerns on opening opposition. The first thing is that we immediately begin the negotiation process, and we play both sides off each other because we want them involved. We want to make it clear that we're happy to offer amnesties where necessary and to have them involved in reconstructing the country in the name of protecting people. The second thing we do, however, is that we establish an interim civilian authority with the support of the Sudanese democracy camp. And this is the interest to see democracy re-established within the country itself. The reason this is important is because this offers the crucial buy-in by people on the ground. We're not simply intervening the way we did in Iraq. We're not putting foreign people in charge of the country, but rather we're working and collaborating with the locals to the extent that this is possible. The third thing we do crucially, though, is that we offer guarantees and rewards to the soldiers and the conscripts who are willing to lay down their arms on our side. And here's the crucial framing, which is that the majority of people in that war simply don't have an alternative. They're neither ideologues nor trained soldiers. And note here the crucial mechanism as to how it is that these people step down. You see a well-trained soldier in modern gear. You often have an outdated uniform and an old rifle that jams on you sometimes. Your stomach hurts and you are exhausted by the experience of war. On our side, we offer you all you need. We offer you protection. We offer you safety for yourself and for those you love. And that is the reason why you step down, because your leadership has failed you. You know that you're disposable, and you know that on our side we want to offer this peace. And this is precisely how we stop the conflict. Because even if they're right and we cannot get groups to negotiate with us, we get them to basically lose the support of the majority of those forces. And that is precisely what can change the situation. But also, fourthly and very importantly, we tactically clear out areas where possible, but we do a cost calculation as to civilian casualties. Crucially, many areas can be captured without firing a single bullet. Why? If you're able to cut military supply lines, that is precisely when forces can be incentivized to surrender. That is, you can basically get them to tactically retreat to different areas of the country if they're threatened by being surrounded. The people who stay behind are often the ones who precisely want to surrender, and that is why we are able to secure those civilian centers. Note then what this means. We take a very low burden claim, which is that we're able to protect civilians within many population centers. This is important because we're talking about the majority of the populace, and we also merely stop these people from becoming refugees the way they do in the status quo. But even if this is not right, we are able to directly provide the aid to those individuals. Let me now respond to the case you hear from opening opposition. The first thing I want to point out is that we have fiat and definitional power within this debate. This necessarily means that they cannot just push on me that, like, Libya or the Ukraine are going to continue doing horrible things with the equipment they give. But this intervention has to be effective. Importantly, deterrence most happens against countries like Saudi Arabia when you do have peacekeepers on the ground. Tajei explains to you the tripwire mechanism, which is that if your gun, if your drone with your country's tag on it kills a UN officer, that is when those countries will be hit by sanctions. The next thing I will point out, however, is that the OO counter model is just not mutually exclusive. I am happy to stop military support. I am happy to do non-military forms of intervention. Simply then, they just haven't given you much of a case for the first half of their speech. However, I even want to note how it is that weapons smuggling happens. That is, it's not the case that you have like clearly demarcated weapons shipments. That is, most weapons come in through things like foreign aid or food aid. They're being masqueraded at the border. The problem is you can only effectively stop the import of weapons when you have boots on the ground. On their side, to do so, they have to be overly cautious. Therefore, for every single packet of ammo they stop, that is tens of tons of civilian aid and health equipment that is necessary to protect those civilians. Therefore, they're the side that has to starve the country out in this debate preemptively. Next up, I want to explain why it is that they're not able to stop the war the way they're saying. The first problem is that opening opposition hasn't heard of the Kalashnikov, which is one of the cheapest guns to produce, to manufacture, or to use. Given the reliability of this, it's simply false that you don't have the equipment to keep the war going. That is, both sides have bought much ammunition preemptively, and therefore they're very ready to continue fighting on their side. The second problem, however, is that they don't respond to our mechanism about UN peacekeepers. And the problem is that even if you want to fight the other side, you have no reason to escalate in the areas that we are protecting, insofar that this puts you at a tactical disadvantage. You basically have a standoff in the sense that if you are the one fighting the UN, that's going to make you weaker in the conflict. But also thirdly, mercenaries form a minority of those operations, so it's simply false that they're going to be like the prevalent force that keeps the war going. Next up, I want to basically clash on them on the question of fragmentation and explain why it is we're very happy to see it. I'll take up your wife in closing, please.
Your claim about abusive modeling is true but hypocritical. At the point where you defend like paying soldiers to leave the army, that is no longer a military intervention.
I literally have people with rifles on the ground, and I'm basically pushing these people. Like, this is fake, I'm sorry. Let me then explain why it is that the other model bashing about the UN forces doesn't work. Firstly, we fiat in accountability, then that's fine. Secondly, though, we will prioritize the trustworthy countries for areas where you have a high chance of crimes, etc. I just don't think they can just push on me that this happens badly. Finally, on fragmentation. Why is fragmentation good? The first one is that at the point at which you have the military breaking apart, the person who is likely to rise in charge of the factions is the one who is most able to gain concessions from the West. That is, when you see that your legitimacy and your on-the-ground support is falling apart, you need someone who can push the conflict to an end. Secondly, and crucially, this means that we apply preemptive pressure to leadership. That is, the fact that your subordinates may coup you, exactly because what we're describing doesn't just affect people on the ground, but rather you fear that you'll be taken out, you're afraid that basically you're going to have what you have worked for taken away, and you fear for your life and for your family's well-being. That is when you are pushed to negotiate with the intervening forces. Therefore, I just think that even if you have extremist factions, these are the ones who are going to lose support the quickest. Even beyond this, I think that the factions themselves infighting is a good thing, insofar attention is focused away from the civilian centers and away from the more moderate parts. We are the ones who show you how we're able to get any form of lasting peace, and we protect the people harmed the most. For all these reasons, I'm very proud to propose.
I'm going to prove two things. Firstly, I'll prove that our countermodel ends the war faster and with less deaths than side-opening government. Secondly, I'll prove that their intervention substantially worsens the war from the status quo, killing millions of people, by far the biggest impact in the debate. Let's start with why we're able to end the war. The first thing I want to note is that Jack explains very clearly why our countermodel is likely to be extremely effective. That is to say, firstly, that weapons bans means far fewer weapons within that country and therefore far less capacity to kill. Secondly, that less money for either side means less weapons, means fewer militias, means it's harder to pay off locals, means that the conflict grinds to an end. And finally, less foreign support means that each party feels weaker. The incentive to continue the conflict is lower, the political pressure against them is stronger, and is not counterbalanced by the support of international participants. That explains why the parties are in a much weaker position, and opening opening government concedes themselves that they say many people just want to lay down their arms. They say many people don't want the war to occur. They're just looking for a Schelling point for peace. That is precisely why our counter model provides the very mechanism necessary to convince those parties to come to a table, provides, for example, independent parties to the war who are not fighting in it, who can negotiate that settlement, who can enforce the agreements that occur, can ensure that peace occurs. That is not possible on their side when these participants have militarily intervened in the country, when they are not trusted, and when they're not seen as impartial. What are the responses we get to this argument? Firstly, they say, well, why is our countermodel mutually exclusive from theirs? 3 reasons. Firstly, fiat. They use their fiat to do their model. We use our fiat to do our countermodel. You can't do 2 things. Secondly, because it's literally mutually exclusive, you are intervening and sending more people into the country. We're saying we're pulling people out of the country. We're banning people from being able to participate or support that conflict. Those things are literally the opposite of each other. But thirdly, because we explain the process of intervening means intervening badly. Because when you allow, as this team says in their model, regional powers to lead the UN force into that region, they have incentives to do it badly. They have incentives to support different factions within the war to empower them so they can control resources, so they're ideologically more important within the country, so that they have more of a stake in the Sudan that forms at the end of the conflict, which explains why it is bad. The second thing they say is like, well, why are more weapons bad? What if we just have less weapons but use them more or something? But Jack explains many reasons why more weapons are bad. First is just that weapons tend to be destroyed over the time period of the conflict. So yes, if you have fewer weapons, your capacity to engage in violence literally erodes. But secondly, obviously things like aircraft can kill far more people than something like an AK-47, which is why the most intense conflicts are those with the most advanced weapons, with by far the most civilian deaths. If fewer people are able to die each day because each side is weaker, that is a massive win for our side. But finally, we would just note that if you think about historical comparisons, clearly the wars that have been far more devastating are the ones as weapons technology has increased. You just can't mount the kinds of operations that you can on their side. Like if all you have is AK-47s and the conflict's kind of frozen, very few people die. But when you have drones, you can reach over the no man's land. When you have planes, you can engage in strikes of other people's capitals. You can hurt civilians in a way that you cannot on the other side. Finally, we explain why we're very likely to get political resolution on our side. What does this team have to say there? Firstly, they say we'll get reconstruction and peace because we'll enforce rule of law. But firstly, like, how do you change the facts on the ground? They say, well, we'll just cooperate with everyone who exists there at the moment. So as soon as you leave, those people will just resume the war because they still have all the same incentives to want more territory, to want more land, to want more resources. That doesn't end the conflict. Secondly, they say we'll give people amnesty, which will never work because if they freeze the conflict the way it is, the RFS still controls some territory, the SAF still controls some territory. Why would you ever believe these amnesties will be enforced once the West leaves and you're surrounded by your political enemies who obviously want to kill you? That would never work. Finally, they say, well, we can just exit because we won't have hubris. The reason you can't exit is because the conflict is frozen. You know as soon as you leave, it will restart, which ties you there forever, slowly losing troops, slowly bleeding the country to death with nothing ever changing. On our side, political solutions are viable. We erode the capacity of states to fight, which means that the cost of violence is higher and the benefits of peace are greater. We explain why political solutions are viable because they've happened before, both in Sudan and in other countries, but also because we have parties that can negotiate and enforce those agreements because they're not involved in the conflict themselves. They say, and obviously, those things are much harder to do when you're involved. Firstly, for the reason that you've killed many people and you've lost trust. People feel that you are complicit in the conflict, that you are a bad actor, and they don't want you negotiating the surrender when they feel that you cannot do so. Finally, we would just note that morally, it is wrong to be complicit in the conflict in the way that this side would. They say they would work with the RSF, that is currently committing a genocide against the Masalit people in Darfur. They say they would work with the SAF, an autocratic organization that kills people. We say it is morally wrong to do that. It is certain that it is morally wrong, and you ought not be complicit in it, both because it is morally wrong, but also because when you are complicit in atrocities, they tend to happen far more than when you are not, which is why you ought not be part of that. That explains why on our side, it's very likely that we could see an end of the war because we decrease the incentive to continue the conflict and we increase the incentive for peace. We have the mechanisms necessary for that peace to occur.
You say your thing is mutually exclusive because they're increasing weapons and you're decreasing weapons, but weapons are not entirely fungible, right? Like they can stop increasing weapons in one way while still cracking down on bad weapons
the second and third responses to that argument still hold, both about fiat and also because the intervention will necessarily occur badly and involve those weapons being brought in. You can't fiat that out. Actors have incentives to do bad things. Let's talk about why they'll worsen the conflict. And I want to note here the huge problem for opening government is they just sidestep huge parts of the debate. They're like, well, we'll have troops on the ground and they'll stop the violence. How are they fucking getting on the ground? You have to invade the country. That's where millions of civilians die. So they tell you, well, we protect civilians on our side. No, you kill millions of civilians in getting your troops there in the first place. The RAF and the SAF don't want you there. They want to be able to continue the war, which is why people die. They don't explain why they would cooperate with you. And if the reason is just that, well, they have to, they don't explain why once you leave, the war doesn't just restart. Secondly, though, they don't explain a capacity to stop violence on civilians. Firstly, you could just attack the UN troops, just as our US troops were attacked in Afghanistan. You could attack the troops where they're not. You can't have troops in every part of the country and in every city. Or in Yugoslavia, maybe the US troops just do nothing as genocide continues to occur. No explanation as to why civilians are helped there. But we give you many reasons why things get far, far worse. Firstly, because you fragment the conflict, because the UAE has different incentives to Egypt, has different incentives to to Azerbaijan and to Russia, which means that you have different groups getting more weapons, weapons being leaked to those various groups, resource extraction occurring, all which makes the conflict harder to resolve, which means there are more actors, there are more groups you need to bring to the table, but it also means more people dying, because the invasion will kill people, because more weapons will kill people, because you're complicit in the violation of sovereignty and in the atrocities and the genocide that will certainly occur. This was a bad idea. You ought not be involved.
The problem for opening government in this debate is that while they identify stopping the war is obviously a good thing, they fail to really engage with what opening opposition says about their counterfactual mechanism for stopping the war. So, closing government will enter this debate in two ways. The first thing that we'll explain is that in the short term, you will get far more brutality in Sudan through the way that opening opposition wants to stop the war. And the second thing we'll explain is that in the long run, the kind of government that opening opposition gets would be incredibly bad without UN intervention. Let's start with why the measures needed to stop the war on their side would be far worse in the short term. Because the thing that I want to identify here is that they say, well, these groups would be poorer and therefore we would disempower them and would be less brutal, which is totally afactual to what we see through the rest of history, which is that when these groups become poorer, when these groups become more desperate, that is when they are at their worst. That is when you get the worst kinds of atrocities. That's when you get the things that are truly chilling. Why is it that these groups being far poorer is way worse? The first thing to say is that they now have to find alternative ways of displaying their power. When they don't have the guns, when they don't have the actual power over these groups, they have to rely far more on how they're perceived, which increases their incentive to do things like public massacres, to do things like engendering fear in that population in order to control them, which means that you get far more of the most performative and most brutal forms of repression. Secondly, when they don't have the money to be able to pay their soldiers, that means they're far more likely to do coercive things. That's things like running through towns doing conscription. That's things like getting child soldiers. Thirdly, when they can't get resources externally, for instance by exporting things from the gold mines that they have, or by getting the humanitarian support that opening government points out, they need to get more resources domestically. That looks like taking slaves. That looks like the expropriation of property, which is incredibly harmful. And finally, they do more brutal things for the reason that they have less targeted weapons. Yeah.
Why don't they do these things right now?
Because they have less of an incentive to when they have other mechanisms for being able to achieve their goals. Because every single one of the things that I talk about comes with an associated cost, right? Like, for instance, you lose support in the population. So at the moment, the benefit of that is smaller than the cost, so they don't do it. But now, when they don't have other alternatives, the cost is the benefit of it is smaller than the cost, so they do it far more. The final thing to say is that they have far less targeted weapons. That's to say that they're more likely to go around massacring people with machetes when they don't have access to the drones that these guys talk about, which are likely to allow them to take out far smaller groups of people. We think that it's a bad thing when you have the most brutal machete massacres. And I know this seems like a narrow delta, but it's actually not. Like, a large number of people being killed by a machete is one of the most horrific things that can happen to a person. Why is it that we stop these bad things from happening? First of all, we can simply end the sanctions faster. As opening government describes, we're able to send in a large number of UN soldiers, massively overwhelm them, and end the conflict faster. But secondly, we're able to directly protect those civilians when that is happening, so we have troops there. That means they're not subject to it. No. Second argument, why is it that any solution would be bad? Because opening opposition says, we will end this, they will come to the bargaining table, and we will have a long-term government. And there's no work done to describe what that long-term government looks like, and we think that that long-term government would be absolutely horrific. Because when they put down their arms and we have a negotiation, probably what it looks like is a power-sharing agreement between the Sudanese armed forces and the Janjaweed, which is the solution that was started before. Why would you have to involve the Janjaweed in any long-term resolution? First of all, they are incredibly powerful themselves. Secondly, by opening opposition's own mechanism, it's about bringing these groups together and negotiating. Thirdly, this group has a large number of other ethnic groups aligned with them who would not buy into any peace without them being a part of that agreement. Fourthly, they have a history of coups against that government, which means that you wouldn't have stability without including them. Fifthly, if they weren't included in it, then the UAE, who's been supporting the Janjaweed aggressively, has more of an incentive to foment chaos within that country in order to get their supporters back within that country, noting fully half of Sudan's exports go to the UAE. This is incredibly important to them. And finally, the Janjaweed has a large number of very important gold mines. Any government that didn't involve them would be incredibly poor. What are the harms of involving the Janjaweed in a long-term power-sharing solution in this country? First of all, it would be highly unstable and incredibly likely to break down, as it has done so before. And that is not only because the Janjaweed and the SAF are very opposed to each other, but also the Janjaweed is very internally unstable, with various leaders and power factions within it rising. So even if you got an agreement in the first instance, it's likely that that agreement wouldn't last into the long term. Secondly, it would now be impossible to stop the Janjaweed from streaming across the countryside, committing ethnic cleansing, because they would be a part of the government. They would have power in that government, and that is absolutely horrific. Thirdly, when you have two big power bases within government, it shifts governance incentives in an incredibly pernicious way. Because when you're one government who's controlling that country, the growth of that country 100% accrues as its benefit to you. Whereas when there's two power bases in government, only 50% of the growth of a country accrues to you as a benefit. What accrues to you 100% is relocating resources from the other set of ethnic groups to your set of ethnic groups. So you have far more of an incentive not to grow the country, but to redistribute the pie from other people to your aligned set of people. That explains why the government that opening opposition gets would be incredibly bad. The next thing I just want to briefly explain is why it is that we think this intervention would work and why you wouldn't get mass fight back from the SAF and the RSF. The first thing to say is whatever group of those two was the first to attack the UN soldiers would disadvantage themselves in a pairwise comparison between the two of them, right? Because now the UN soldiers would target whatever group was being more militaristic towards them, which would mean that the RSF, like if it's the RSF, they would lose out to the SAF where that conflict was continuing because they would more have to deal with the UN soldiers. And secondly, they would see what's coming. They would see we're heading for a democratic government, and they wouldn't want to, for instance, be banned from running in those future elections, which gives them an incentive not to be the party that is incredibly bad. The final thing that I want to prove in this speech is that Sudan needs a democratic state and cannot have an authoritarian state as the future, because there can be some prosperous authoritarian states, but a number of structural features of Sudan means it will never be a prominent prosperous authoritarian state. First of all, it's an incredibly resource-rich country out of time. It's an incredibly resource-rich country, which means that you don't really have an incentive to share the pie, because if your economy relies on services or agriculture, you need to grow and develop the population because you're reliant on labor-intensive industries to make you money. When you're very resource-dependent, it's not very labor-intensive, so you don't really care about the population, which explains why an authoritarian state in this instance doesn't have an incentive to enfranchise the population and make them better. Secondly, this is not a sufficiently homogenous state. It has a high amount of ethnic tension, and authoritarian one-party states rely on enough homogeneity within the population for them all to be able to agree on one government or one power structure that is able to lead it. Because it is so divided, you'd never be able to get that agreement on what that power structure needs to be, which means you need democracy in which you can enfranchise a plurality of voices. And thirdly, you need to develop unaligned institutions. The problem with a power-sharing agreement is all the institutions would still be either SAF or RSF, just in a temporary truce against each other, which makes it incredibly unstable. On our side, we can develop unaligned institutions which can be truly prosperous into the future.
Fair warning, this will be quick. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Helen will deal with CG, I'll deal with OG rather, I'll deal with CG and OL. First, on CG, their first argument is that you get more brutality when you resource constrain these countries. One, they mitigate their own argument. They tell you that there are huge political costs to doing these kinds of things. The RSF and SAF won't go to child soldiers unless they absolutely need it. There's no reason why this is the likely counterfactual. Second, they create this incentive on their side when they make the enemy of these groups far stronger by creating a huge military intervention. That's why you need to go out and recruit child soldiers and start doing things like expropriating property from other people. Their second argument is that you get a better long-term government because the Janjaweed is going to mess with all of your stuff. This is completely symmetric on their side of the house. They never prove why the Janjaweed is likely to be excluded from the government if the UN steps in. Secondly, the democracy claim is not explained. They impact democracy, but they never make the argument itself. New mechanisms are allowed in WIP, but new arguments are not. Charlie cannot extend on this. Then on opening opposition, the problem is that the countermodel is entirely unrealistic. They say that they're going to cut off all weapons, but as OG realistically points out, they knife themselves when they say that there are weapons spillovers. So it's entirely unclear how they block any weapons from entering the country. The second problem is more meta. The actor that they do this for, that is the UAE and Turkey groups that are already involved, is different from the actor that OG specifies. So they can't do counter fiat on this actor, given that it is a different set of groups. And third and finally, I just don't think they prove enforcement. That is, there are many nations like Russia, China, Syria just finished a civil war and has a bunch of weapons lying around. It's really unclear how they're going to deny all these weapons from entering the country. Finally, it's non-unique. They don't prove that the sanctions don't already exist in the status quo. Then, what does CO defend? We think that the likely counterfactual is that the UN uses the resources that it does not put into a peacekeeping mission in Sudan into better, more tractable conflicts. No, this doesn't knife the OO model. Even if you believe that you can do arms embargoes, you can just do the arms embargoes and do interventions either way, but we're not dependent on the OO model of arms embargoes for this to work. First claim, the UN is uniquely capacity constrained right now in its peacekeeping missions. This started with Nikki Haley under Trump, who did things like withdraw from the UN Human Rights Council and signal a return to US isolationism. Under Biden, this trend continued. Tom Perriello, the US envoy to Sudan, resigned because he felt like he wasn't getting enough support from the Trump administration. And Elise Stefanik, Trump's next nominee to be the ambassador to the UN, is likely to continue these trends. He is similarly isolationist and is unwilling to intervene in foreign conflicts except for Israel. Then, the peacekeeping budget broadly has dropped 25%. This was in The Economist this morning, from $8 billion to $6 billion. This $2 billion reduction in the past year means that current conflicts are already capacity constrained. The UN cannot afford to go into a new place. Finally, the African Union, which might be expected to fill in the gaps in its backyard, is also struggling with the fiscal cliff. Many nations are suffering from huge debt burdens after COVID, which is why William Ruto was almost recently ousted in Kenya because of the huge austerity measures he's had to take after debt. There's just no money to spend on this intervention. Second, this intervention is likely to be uniquely expensive. First, the RSF and SAF are relatively even powers, which means tipping the scales is incredibly difficult. You can't step in on one side and expect to smite the other immediately. Second, it's a proxy war. There are many arms flowing in from abroad, which means you don't just need to counter domestic actors, you also need to counter international actors like the UAE, who are likely to spark an arms race and funnel more weapons in as you funnel your own weapons in. Third, there's a legacy of violence, things like Janjaweed militias conducting the Darfur genocide, which means they're likely to engage in the worst kinds of violence, which are incredibly hard to stop. Fourth and finally, there are high variable costs. A military doesn't have very large fixed costs. Instead, you need to do things like pay boots on the ground for a larger intervention. This extension has two implications on the round. First, it means that the intervention that OG defends is limited in scale and short term. We limit the total amount of fiat power that OG can access. They needed to prove that there was some willingness from this actor to do this in the first place. At best, they get a year of intervention and it's immediately repealed by the UN. Sure.
Yeah, the fiat they're using in this debate is from the perspective of the international community, who could just fund the UN more in order to do OG's model.
Yeah, but I guess you don't get permanent fiat on your side of the house, and it is some ways dependent on the incentives of the actor itself. So if the UN doesn't want to intervene in Sudan, you can't compel them to do it over time. And the other thing I'll say here is that they say they're going to fight fire with a hose. I think it is more like just passing water buckets down the line while the fire grows bigger and bigger. Second implication for the round, this trades off with more tractable peacekeeping efforts. That is, we can better deploy UN resources, and this is the likely counterfactual. The first case where this happens is places where you can work with a pre-existing government. Yeah, Tajei.
Middle Eastern actors are unwilling to support other interventions when the West is seen as ignoring Sudan.
Yeah. they're much more likely to support other interventions that they don't have a direct stake in, right? Like they continue getting gold because of the civil war. They're much more likely to support an intervention that doesn't have a direct impact on their gold supply. Then, working with the government is much easier. You can do things like collaborate with an existing military and share intelligence, whereas on their side of the house, they are fighting a battle on two fronts. This looks like things like working with Lola Tinubu in Nigeria to combat insurgent groups like Boko Haram, or going into Haiti to fight gang violence. These things are both broadly popular, meaning that there's one side which has the people's support and you can rely on for intelligence, and just have much more capacity than going in as a third party without relying on either of the two pre-existing parties. And second, you can go into places that are less sophisticated. That is, places like the civil war in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where there aren't pre-existing paramilitary groups that you have to fight against. Instead, it's much smaller militias, which means you're more likely to win and create a tipping point to humanitarian intervention. These conflicts also deserve our attention. This is a normative debate, not just about what is best for Sudan, and we are better able to make a change in these places with UN resources. Second piece of extension is that peace talks get much harder on their side of the house. A couple reasons why peace talks are viable in the status quo. First, the RSF is already at the table. They came to peace talks in August 2024 in Switzerland. Second, there's international connections. That is, the UAE is involved and has a partnership. Third, the fall of Assad in Syria creates fear in the SAF that their regime will fall too and makes them more likely to negotiate. And fourth, there already was a peace settlement in 2021. This is much better analysis than OO, who says that peace talks are politically viable just because of their unrealistic arms embargo countermodel. Then, why do peace talks fail on their side of the house? Most basically, the mechanism that OO misses is that on their side of the house, you have to attack both the SAF and the RSF at the same time. They are both doing human rights atrocities, so you turn both of them against you. And no, this does not create an incentive for both of them to stay out of it, as CG says. For instance, in Syria, Kurdistan, Turkey, and ISIS all fight against each other all the time, even if they have aligned interests for some of the time. The implication for the round is pretty clear. I don't think either side proves that there's going to be long-term stability in Sudan. It's just unrealistic to expect that the next government is going to be very stable. But in the immediate term, we allow for things like a ceasefire. This is how you actually get humanitarian aid into the country, if people lay down their arms for a brief period of time so you can get trucks bearing food and water to people who need them the most. Proud to oppose.
Firstly, defending the extension, secondly, on closing opposition, and then finally on opening opposition. The weighing against, other way around, a weighing against opening government. The weighing against opening government will be done integrated with the responses to opening opposition. Firstly, then, on defending our extension, I think the most important response we get in that speech to our claim is that we create the same incentives for conflict to escalate because we also create an impetus for more desperation. There are a few issues with this. Firstly, the way this has been set up by opening government is not as an armed conflict against another like a full invasion of another country where you're attempting to wage war and introduce a third party to that war. That might create a large amount of desperation. The way this has been modeled by opening government is that you'd send in UN peacekeepers to create stability within regions, to function as a civilian military police force, to set up, for example, things like courts, to stabilize areas in which you can root out conflict. That's different in a meaningful way because it means that you don't get the same level of increase in desperation that's required for this flip to work. Secondly, if this is true, we quite obviously prefer that the conflict ends sooner because this requires an acknowledgement that escalation happens, that when parties in a conflict are more desperate, they get substantially more brutal. If you believe that to be true, you should prefer a world in which you have UN peacekeepers on the ground in order to prevent the worst parts of that brutality, and you have some form of military intervention in order to ensure that the conflict from which desperation is arising ends faster rather than lasting longer. And we explained a series, I think there's a pretty clear series of reasons why it is that it will end substantially faster when you have military intervention. That is because the distance inability between UN forces and other forces is so great that it's unlikely this desperation manifests in more brutality, but rather in members of this armed conflict putting arms down, giving up, being less able to find troops at all in any form. Thirdly, the UN presence might escalate the incentive for brutality, but it also escalates the trade-off against that brutality, which means that it doesn't actually cause the amount of brutality to increase in the end. That is to say, the local people now have a third option from the SAF and the RSF, which means that so the trade-off we explain with brutality is you get more people because you're able to make them more scared of you, but they also like you less because they're more scared of you now. That is an accentuated trade-off when you have a third party to the RSF and the SAF who are in there as a presence in order to provide people an alternative towards things. So in addition to not wanting them to radicalize against you, you specifically don't want them to turn towards and cooperate more with UN peacekeepers, which means the amount of brutality doesn't go up. Fourthly, many of the things we say are not about desperations, but are about the means that the RSF and the SAF have, which is to say, if you cannot arm all of your troops with guns, you need to make the civilian population believe that if they step out of line of your control or cooperate with other forces or engage in something that might undermine your rule, you still have the power to crack down on them. If you can't literally show with a gun in your hand that you're going to crack down on them, or if you only have a few troops that are stationed in that town in order to demonstrate that you can crack down on them, you need to engage in public demonstrations of brutality that make people so scared of stepping out of line they never even consider it. That looks like beheadings in the streets. It looks like massacres that people hear of and know the fear that that region will have. That is all far more accentuated, not because of the amount of desperation that occurs, but because of the amount of armaments because of the change in armaments that happen. Fifthly, we explain that in the worst case, the UN will be there to protect people. So as I said before, we'd rather it happen on our side. They then say that we mitigate the amount of brutality that will increase by saying that they don't want this because of trade-offs, but this is a pretty uncomparative argument. That is the status quo level of brutality that occurs. We meaningfully change the way this trade-off happens, which increases the amount of brutality. Finally, in response to our second extension, all they say is that we don't explain a reason why the Janjaweed would not have to be involved on either side, but I think the reason for this is intuitive, which is to say that you no longer require watching from the background and hoping that the two sides come together to form things like courts and infrastructure in order to run government. We provide an alternative, which is international forces setting up those courts and setting up that infrastructure for democracy and for government, which means that neither party necessarily needs to be the primary force in that. And even if you think that it requires support from both the SAF and the RSF in order to make those infrastructure happen, it's substantially better when you have an intermediary between those two who can ensure that the worst excesses and beliefs of either side don't manifest in the infrastructure of a country going into the future being premised on ethnic cleansing, genocide, and violation of people's rights. So we prefer a world in which that is mediated by international forces physically on the ground rather than externally hoping for the best. So let's respond to closing oppositions then. They say that we can't afford this into the long term. Firstly, we have long-term fear in addition to short-term fear. This argument essentially amounts to the same thing like Year 6 debaters say when they're like, well, this policy would get repealed after it's implemented, so you can't enforce it. We have fiat over it being implemented into the long term. Secondly, opening opposition's model is also expensive. Sanctions cost a huge amount of money. So if they have acknowledged that we have this level of fiat, closing opposition has to stand by it. And thirdly, the spending creates incentive for more spending, which is to say, once you do a military intervention, it's politically unpopular for that intervention to fail. So once you've started it, that's where you get the momentum for more spending, even if there currently isn't a lot in the status quo. Next, they say there's a trade-off against other interventions. Firstly, Sudan is the most pressing, and secondly, this is contingent on this intervention failing. If it is likely to be a successful intervention, obviously it's the best trade-off to make. Finally, they say that we could have US peace talks. I don't understand the reason why peace talks wouldn't be more successful on our side. We create the incentive in order to engage in those peace talks by creating better infrastructure in order to do so. The rest of the speech then is going to concentrate on opening opposition and explain why our extension is the most important in the debate. They claim we would use counter-fiat to sanction and disarm the conflict. Obviously, none of this is mutually exclusive, but our Deputy Prime Minister doesn't really explain why that's true. The reason why sanctions are not mutually exclusive to military intervention is that military intervention creates the impetus for sanctions. If you are intervening in a conflict, you do not want the opposition to that conflict to have guns, which is why military intervention enables sanctions and disarmament of a region. They have a few responses then that doesn't get captured by DPM. They say the regional powers will make up the UN troops, so they'll be destabilizing. Firstly, we have fear over who the composition is, so it's not going to be those people. But secondly, regional actors also want stability, which is what makes them less unlikely to be destabilizing, even if there are other regional actors. They say if you bring in weapons, the local forces will get hold of them. This is true when you're supplying arms to other people in a conflict, not when you're bringing your own forces with those guns, because those forces will protect the guns. Yes?
Even if each individual soldier is more brutal, there are more soldiers on your side. More jihadis, more malicious, more mercenaries, more chatting rebels, more living rebels.
Well, they can't get the mercenaries if they can't pay for them. I think it's unlikely that other people from outside of the conflict come in if that conflict is both being intervened by the UN, where you are therefore unlikely to succeed, but also I don't think it's really explained why that really creates a meaningful incentive for them to distract from the other conflicts they're already a part of, and they have stronger ideological reasons to care about that. But also, it's not true that there are fewer soldiers, just that they get those soldiers in worse ways, which we explain, like through conscription or through using child soldiers, which is substantially worse because we should care about those people too. Secondly, this is obviously contingent then on proving that UN peacekeepers are overrun. We explain those peacekeepers are well-trained, well-armed, and fresh, and less tired of war, which means they're unlikely to have arms slip over. Why is this important? It's important in two ways that DPM doesn't point out. Firstly, it proves we're intervention will be successful and escalation won't happen. Because if you can prevent countries from wanting to further help Sudan by sanctioning them, that should explain why it's unlikely that intervention leads to escalation in the long term. But secondly, it explains why OO is uncomparative. De-escalation happens faster when coupled with a threat and an outside actor on the ground. And this is important because sanctions starve civilians, specifically when the arms come through humanitarian aid. So on their side, to make sanctions effective and disarmament effective, they must block humanitarian aid. We block it for less wrong. We prove that sanctions without military intervention don't work and make things worse. OO never explains how the incentive changes to make peace happen. Both sides might have less weapons, but they're still symmetrically weaker and still want to kill each other. Even when arms are set down, how do you stabilize a poor conflict? We do it with the UN. Very proud to govern.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. OG tells us that when there is a fire, we ought put the fire out. So what I don't understand is that in a world where there are wildfires all across the world, why it is the case that we ought put out this fire rather than other fires that are much more efficient and much easier. Because presumably, a life is a life, right? A dollar is a dollar. So what they need to do is situate this debate in the normative world, not just talk about in abstract whether or not this is good for Sudan, but whether this decision is good for Sudan relative to other priorities that the UN could be making in the status quo. Why do we win this debate? We actually take the Gov bench's mechanisms about why the UN is pretty well trained and well armed, but what we do is introduce the capacity constraints that uniquely exist in the status quo. And we explain why these same well-armed troops could be going into things like the DRC, right? Could be going into places like Haiti, where the marginal efficiency of each dollar and each troop on the ground is far higher, and the violence reductions that you are able to achieve are far better, which is the reason why we get more sustainable lives saves in the long run. And the reason why these types of things are mutually exclusive is what Ethan described to you, because of the fiscal and personnel costs that they incur. But secondarily, because very oftentimes these priorities are set regionally. That is, you set the countries that you are able to prioritize in a given year, and when it becomes a thing like you prioritize something like Sudan, it becomes exceptionally difficult to get the buy-in to intervene in other countries like Haiti and the DRC. But thirdly, because people are specialized, so obviously the troops that exist in Africa, the experts that are knowledgeable in Africa are limited on both sides of the house, which is the reason why there is a substantive trade-off that exists. And Ethan provided the mechanisms for why when you're able to work with local groups on the ground, when you're actually able to take an explicit side, which they just do not respond to in our POI, it's far easier to create substantive change and to enforce peace in the long run, because they don't even describe who is going to be leading the government, who is going to be put into office, who is going to be leading these local institutions. Because presumably, if it's the SAF, that is the counterfactual. The RSF is a paramilitary group that operates extra-legally and extrajudiciarily, so it is entirely unclear to me why they do not get backsliding on their side of the house. The second thing that we prove is just that peace talks are possible, and this is a scalar impact. We do not need to prove that they get peace entirely, but just that it is possible to have a ceasefire, and the ability to do so gets a lot worse on their side of the house. And the reason for this is because we already told you that the RSF is willing to come to the negotiation table because they want to be seen as a force for democracy, and they want to be seen as relatively reasonable in the international stage. So the question is, who better gets the SAF onto the negotiation table? What we told you is when you militarily intervene, institutions like Europe and the US, which were previously seen as aligning with the SAF, has an incentive to further isolate them. That is, when they do not explicitly take a side, when they do things like try to shut down both SAF and RSF institutions, it becomes way harder, for instance, to convince Egypt to apply pressure to get SAF to the negotiation table. It means this trades off with substantive things like economic sanctions that you can use to convince the SAF to come to the negotiation table, or humanitarian aid packages that you can use to offer the SAF as a very tangible metric. So obviously, if they do not engage with the substantive ways that these negotiations exist in the status quo, they cannot prove that they just somehow get better on their side of the house. Next, on OG. There are massive gaps in their case, and I think the simplest way to describe it is just capacity. First, it is fine if the UN has good incentives, but they do not describe how many troops and weapons it needs for this to take place. They do not explain how this balances with competing priorities. They do not explain why you win over the RSF and SAF, besides just saying people are scared to kill UN troops. Okay, what if they do accidentally? Then what happens? And the reason why these things are unlikely to work is number one, these groups are decentralized, so it's not like you can just tell every single worker every single one of your soldiers to not touch UN troops. Two, they're ideologically motivated. That is, the RSF is willing to take extreme actions because they believe that they want to unify all of Sudan. So it is very unclear to me why when the UN peacekeeper wears their little blue hat, they're just going to suddenly back down and say, hey, you guys can take our country, right? Like they've been fighting for decades. The third reason is because obviously they have far better evasion techniques. To the extent that you do not want this to be massively costly, then surely the RSF and SAF massively outnumber these troops, so it is entirely unclear to me why, if they know the geographical regions, they can just outmaneuver the UN, they can just avoid them in many cases, they can do things like evade accountability by blaming it on the other side to the extent that it is very hard in wars to figure out exactly who killed the UN peacekeeper. All of this stuff is entirely unclear to me. They do not prove capacity. The second reason is because they are just entirely unspecific. Ethan describes that when you do not describe which group you are likely to work with, you double the burden, because now it becomes the case that you trigger your allies like Egypt and the UAE, and now it becomes the case that the proxy wars also upscale, because like the UN doesn't just exist in a vacuum. So to the extent that you send UN peacekeepers, it is entirely unclear to me why Egypt and the UAE just doesn't send more weapons. I don't think you can fiat perfect compliance from them on either side of the house. The third reason is just because this is non-comparative, right? Like they talk about why negotiations are possible, they do not engage with the very likely counterfactual that it is also possible in our side of the house. And the final reason is they just do not do any incentive analysis about why the fighters on the ground are likely to have anti-Western sentiment, why DeGallo has fostered these passionate beliefs for many, many years, and why the UN peacekeepers have a more convincing mechanism than they do. Yes, opening.
Charlie says that invasion increases sanctions. Their extension is that sanctions cause more violence. Isn't this very interesting?
Okay, yeah, you can POI them if you want to. CG then fails for many of the same reasons. That is, they point out a problem and they don't provide a substantive solution that actually has efficacy in the long run. Like maybe it is the case that like for 5 years you set up courts in these institutions. They do not fiat why if you do not actually take away the RSF's claims to power that they do not just rise again, right? Like if the UN, if it is true they get perfect fiat and the UN just does this for the rest of time, surely this is super costly and super expensive. Entirely unclear to me how they get enforcement. Why do we win over OO? OO wants to argue that you have a magic wand that like gets all weapons to disappear. Surely in every conflict and war motion, I could counter-model, like, I'm gonna make all the weapons in the world disappear. Yes, world peace. Like, how does this happen, right? There's compliance costs. So even if we bought this was true, the cost to do this, to convince countries to do this internationally, the sanctions and embargoes and negotiations you would have to undertake are surely better used on our side of the house, and we weigh that comparative efficacy. But second, there's probably really large economic costs, which is why we weigh why these costs are better on our side of the house spent on other kinds of things. They also just don't respond to half of the rebuttal they get about why they have less control, why ethnic violence exists with places that are only armed with guns, why there's very cheap guns that can also exist, why you don't get massive losses of legitimacy when the UN is working with things like, I don't know, like Russia and China. Very, very unclear to me. And at the point where their case hinges on a counter model and ours just exists in real life, I think we can very cleanly take this debate.
Give it up for one more round of applause for our semifinals.